Hello. Before we start on the second aspect of how to read a poem to yourself, the first one last time you remember was what is the poem about in general. This one is going to be about why the poem was written. But before that, I want to introduce two ideas to you. One is called emotion recollected in tranquility, and the other one is called adopted persona. And if you understand those two rather highfalutin sounding phrases, you're a long way to knowing how to read a poem. The idea of emotion recollected in tranquility is this. When you're in the height of an intense experience, it's not usually the best time to be writing a poem. You're probably too absorbed in your own experience of grief, someone's just died, or you are in love and all you want to do is to be with the person you're in love with, or you've just suddenly seen some amazing sight or had some amazing experience, and that's not the moment you get your pen out and start writing a poem. Usually experiences are remembered, sometimes from years before, and they've achieved a kind of particular value and importance to the poet because they are that intense that they've stayed in their memory long enough, and the poet wants to somehow get it out on paper. And therefore, the poet uses their experiences of the past to write a poem. And they may well change the experience, just keep the core kernel feeling or some aspect of the experience, but with their imagination alter the thing to make it more interesting for us as the reader, or to make it more satisfying as a work of art in its own right. But the point is that don't assume when you're reading a poem that involves intense feeling that that feeling is actually happening to the writer when they write it. They're usually writing about a feeling they've had some time before, probably years before. The second idea I want to talk about is the idea of the adopted persona. And it's a very common mistake to think that the speaker in the poem is the same person as the poet. Now, obviously, very often it is, but don't assume that. Poets are very clever people, and they will often pretend to be someone else. And it's a device they will use very effectively because it helps you to explore experiences which the poet hasn't themselves had. So, for example, you might pretend you're married to Shakespeare, or that you are Miss Havisham in Dickens's Great Expectations, or you might imagine that you are somewhere completely different, or that you're a mass murderer, and you write as if you are that person. And what you're really doing is giving the reader the chance to explore areas of experience which not even the poet themselves has had directly, but they've worked their imagination to try and explore what it might be like to be that other person or be in that particular situation. So that's called adopting or pretending to be another person, another persona, the adopted persona. It's a very useful idea when you're reading poetry. So the I in a poem, which is such a crucial thing to think about, the narrator, if there is a story to it, but even if there isn't, there's often an I in a poem. And when we come to look at how poems are written, the decision by a poet whether to write in the first or third person, or somewhere in between, is absolutely crucial to the way it's written and the effect it has on us as the reader. But we'll look at that later. So that's the end of my little introductory bit about why poems get written at all. The the main idea, which is really very simple, is this. Poets sometimes want to express their own feelings or the imagined feelings of someone else. And the focus while they're writing it is entirely on their feelings, and they're not really thinking about the reader at all. But sometimes it's the other way around, and they're not really thinking about themselves, and they're very careful in their control of the language to make us laugh, or make us cry, or make us feel pity, or whatever it is, to give us an emotion rather than, or a feeling, or have some experience rather than actually have it themselves, or even remember it themselves. And it's very often it's somewhere between those two. Those are the two ends of the spectrum. And I think when you're reading a poem and trying to discover what you call, some people call the tone of the poem, or the feelings in the poem, it's very helpful to try and think which end of the spectrum or where on the spectrum this poem lies. Because it's very often that is the key to the way words work in the poem. Is the poet really just not really interested in us as the reader, but totally absorbed in getting on paper, really for themselves, some thought, feeling, experience? Or are they really just trying to make us laugh or have a good time or control us, manipulate us in the sort of way that, say, advertising does? So that's it. I don't want to get more complicated than that. There's much more to be said about why poets read poems, rather write poems, but I think that's enough to get you launched without too much difficulty and too much hard work. So good luck, and next time we'll talk in detail about how poems get written, how they're written, and the different things poets have to think about. Bye then.